Senator, whenever you're ready.
Let me welcome all of you to our Washington News Conference. The big news here and the good news is that the House of Representatives has passed the Balanced Budget Amendment. This is the amendment to the Constitution that will require the federal government to live within its means. I applaud this and support it. I'm a co-sponsor of a similar bill here in the Senate, and we will take it up in very short order here in the Senate, and I hope we can pass it here as well. It's obviously a close vote because there is strong opposition among some who think that this is going to put too tight a stricture or restraint upon the flexibility of the government. But there are provisions, let me suggest, that permit the Congress to have a deficit in any given fiscal year if there is an emergency. If there is an emergency caused by national security interests or some economic emergency that justifies spending more than we are projected to take in revenue. And that's simply done by an extraordinary majority of the Congress approving a budget to do that, or approving a bill that does that. So there is flexibility here, but it puts us in a situation where there are constraints against overspending. Congress needs that, it's overdue, and I think it's time we passed it. I'll be glad to talk about that further or take your questions on any other subject. Let's start with Cal Adams in Jackson.
I'd like to talk for a minute, if I could, about the Smithsonian Institution. There is a report down here that the exhibition of the Enola Gay may be put out altogether. Would you agree with that decision?
I think the exhibit ought to be canceled. In my view, after reviewing the script of the exhibit and copies of photographs that will be used, it's not a balanced view. It's a suggestion, even though it may be subtle, that this was a calamitous event. It second guesses those who made the decision to drop the bomb, not explicitly, but that's the impression that you get, that this is a very regrettable event of World War II. Well, all of World War II is regrettable. The beginning of the war was regrettable. There were thousands of Americans who lost their lives. And while the exhibition of the Enola Gay airplane itself, in my view, can be done in a non-controversial way, this is an exhibit that ought to be canceled, and I hope the Board of Regents, when we meet on Monday to take up the issue, will approve the cancellation of it.
Will you approve or discuss any action against those who had set up this exhibition to start with?
I think it should be seriously considered because there are members of the House of Representatives who've called upon the ouster of the director of the Air and Space Museum. But I think we should reserve judgment at this point and look into what exactly was done, who decided what, and I'm not willing to prejudge that issue, but we will consider it. I think it should be at the top of our list. We should thoroughly review this situation. There has crept into the operation of the Smithsonian and many other public institutions this idea of political correctness, the effort to second guess decisions that have been made many, many years ago by public officials and others. These are things that I think we should keep in a proper perspective. This is a national museum, and I'm not prepared for this exhibit to be a form of indictment against any individual or those who were involved in any one event in our history. Let's now go to Andrea Hoffner in Columbus.
Thank you, Senator. Mississippi has such a very large number of people on welfare. What are some of the measures you think should be taken to reform this system?
I think the centerpiece of any federal welfare reform program ought to be more flexibility to state governments, to experiment with better ways of delivering benefits to those who really need help to meet their own nutrition needs or other needs, but at the same time have in that flexibility opportunities to get off welfare, to learn job skills, to try to get out of this cycle of dependency that some generations find themselves locked into with no hope and a feeling of total despair. We need to change the way we go about dealing with welfare issues. It's not all the federal government's responsibility, in my view. State governments have a major role to play, particularly in experimenting with better ways of doing it. So I think that's what we ought to try to do more of. Give flexibility, encouragement to the states to experiment and find better ways of dealing with this serious problem. Brett Austin in Biloxi.
Senator, some people are saying that passage of the Balanced Budget Amendment in the House doesn't mean a whole lot because the Barton Amendment is missing, or the 3/5 majority. It's an invitation just to raise taxes. How would you respond to that?
I strongly disagree. I would vote for the 3/5 requirement and feel that it did have a full debate and discussion in the House of Representatives. The House voted that down. Not enough House members voted to put that in the constitutional amendment. But that, to me, does not mean that we ought not to have the amendment that was passed adopted here in the Senate. I fully support adopting what the House has done. I think it will put new restraints, new incentives to keep the budget in balance, to live within our means. There's no excuse for continuing to build up $100+ billion deficits year after year. We're going to strangle the economic health of this country. We're going to keep our country from realizing the American dream of making available to every American opportunity for economic growth and a high standard of living. So we've got to change the way we've been doing business.
Okay, and what's been the big stalling point on the unfair mandates?
The Democrats have put up a lot of hurdles to cross. They're requiring votes on a wide range of non-germane amendments, basically stalling the issue. Some are suggesting that maybe they don't want to get to the balanced budget amendment issue, and they're putting a lot of delays on the efforts we're making to pass the unfunded mandates bill. Whatever the motivation, it has taken some time to deal with all the amendments that are being offered. We hope we can finish this bill today, but if we can't, we'll finish it next week. It's going to get passed. We have 63 co-sponsors to this legislation that will stop the federal government from indiscriminately shifting the burden of paying for federal programs onto the state and local governments and the local taxpayers. That's what's been happening. It's been happening for too long. This legislation will put a stop to it. We need to pass it now. Let's now go to Bob Yarber in Meridian.
Yes, Senator, we have reports that says that the base closure list may not be as extensive as it was originally thought. Your thoughts on that, and what do you see the future for the base here in Meridian?
I'm really pleased to see Secretary Perry quoted in today's news that we may not have a recommendation from his office to close as many bases as they had earlier anticipated. He suggested that there would be a smaller number than were proposed in the last round of base closures. That's very good news. We've already seen the closing of 130 bases all over the country, many of them very important facilities, major facilities. But what we're finding out is that it costs money to close some of these bases, and they had anticipated selling the property to the private sector interests, and in many cases that's not happening. It's harder to do than they expected. So I'm glad that the Secretary is acknowledging that they will take a different look. They will take a new look at whether or not these bases should be closed. As many as had been anticipated should be closed. We hope Meridian can be kept open. We think it has a very important national security function. It's a modern facility. The people who work there, not only civilians but the military as well, give it very high marks. And so I'm hopeful as we begin this process, but we've got to work hard to be sure that all the facts are considered and brought forward in favor of keeping Meridian open.
And what do you possibly see in the future on the Amtrak situation?
I'm hoping that the hearing yesterday served a good purpose. It illustrated that there are some very serious impacts that could occur if the Amtrak cutbacks are allowed to go through. Not only in places like Meridian, but throughout the southeast of the U.S. We have transportation needs that are very real. And these serious cutbacks as proposed by this administration are going to have very serious economic consequences for our region. And it's appropriate that this Commerce Committee look into it, analyze it, suggest that another review be undertaken for a way to restructure or refinance Amtrak so it can operate more efficiently, but still provide the passenger rail service that we need in our part of the country.
Thank you, Senator.
Now Randy Swan in Greenwood.
Hey, Senator. A couple of weeks ago in Arkansas, a congressman by the name of Jay Dickey said that he was going to try to stop the investigation into Tyson Foods and also former Agriculture Secretary Mike Espy because the investigation was going too far into probing into Tyson's business dealings. He has 3,500 employees in his congressional district. Do you think the investigation is going too far? Has it been handled properly?
One of the problems with these independent investigations is that it's hard to stop them. It's hard to rein them in. The person who is appointed under this arrangement of independent investigation is answerable to no one. We had a real long debate and a thorough review of this law when it was reauthorized just recently. And many of us suggested some options and some alternatives with greater responsibility so that accountability could be placed either on the Attorney General or some other identifiable official who is responsible and is answerable for the actions of an independent investigator. So my suggestion is we had a chance to modify the law, and I sympathize with some of the comments that Congressman Dickey has made. But the law is there. We can only hope that the investigator exercises good judgment and conducts his investigation in a responsible way. That's the situation. Now, Adele Huber in Hattiesburg.
Good morning, Senator. Next week, the Mississippi State Legislature will vote to crack down on deadbeat parents through privatizing child support collection. What is being done on the national level to combat this problem?
We have made a part of some previous legislation a national network of information so that those who are not paying child support can be located. There can be information sharing across state lines. There is a need to do a better job of making parents assume the responsibility for the support of their children. And many fathers have escaped the responsibility in the past, and they ought to be made to live up to their obligations. The responsibilities really, though, fall on the state and local court systems, the civil justice system. And we need to cooperate here at the federal level in any way that that is possible. I'm glad to see in Mississippi new ways of looking at solving this problem are being undertaken. And I applaud those in the legislature and in the governor's office and the governor for taking on the responsibility of looking at new ways of doing this. We need to do a better job of it. Let me thank all of you for being on our Washington News Conference today. I hope you all have a very good weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.